Thank you again, everyone, for coming to our session on the last day. We're from West Virginia University. I'm Erica Shaver. I'm the Vice Chair of Education and Training and the Residency Program Director at West Virginia, which is in Morgantown, West Virginia, if y'all haven't been there before.
I'm Chris Kiefer. I'm the Associate Program Director and the Chief of our Division of Education and Training. And we're going to talk to you guys a little bit this morning about instituting a scholarship oversight committee at our institution and how that improved resident research productivity and how hopefully it'll help at your institution too if you decide to do one. We have no financial disclosures.
Are your residents like ours? They're fun-loving people. They want to be good doctors. They're really excited to get started in your program. They have very similar-looking hobby lines in their ERS application, which includes mountain biking, home brewing, hiking, hanging out with their family and friends. We've all had those residents, right? They all sound the same in a lot of ways. They get great vacations. I feel like my residents get more vacation time off during a year than I do, and they've been on some very lavish vacations, which sometimes I'm a little jealous of. And they seem all on board with the program mission and vision until you start talking with them maybe at the first semi-annual meeting about their research requirements. And a lot of residents that we have come to our program are very focused on a future in community medicine or maybe even rural emergency medicine, which is sort of what we focus on a lot during our training that's a little bit unique. And so when you start talking to them about research, you have a few of them who have maybe had research experience, have had projects done before coming into residency, maybe have a PhD before coming into training, and they're all on board. They love research, they're very experienced, they've done it before, and they're good to go. And then seemingly more commonly in our program, we have a lot of people that would love to hate research, right? They've never done it before, they have zero experience, and they're not really sure where to start when you tell them that part of their scholarly requirement during training is to come up with a project and see it through until the end.
Maybe your faculty are like ours too, that you have the superstar faculty that are at every academic meeting. They mentor 2/3 to 3/4 of all of your resident research projects. They pump out 5 papers a year, and they are on the fast track to becoming full professor, but they're the minority of your faculty because the majority are ones that really you'd have to give every financial incentive in the world and all the structure in the world and maybe even a bribe or two to get them to engage with the research mission. And at the end of the year, when you go to put together ADS, you're kind of embarrassed and nervous that you're going to get a citation from putting them on there because their last scholarly output was in 1985. Well, if that's you, then you're in the right place, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about how we solve this problem at our own program.
So the objectives for our talk are threesome. We're going to briefly talk about the Acgme scholarship requirements for residents and faculty. We're going to describe how our Scholarship Oversight Committee, which we often refer to as the SOC, sort of came about and how you can form one at your institution if you're so interested. And then we're also going to identify how this committee, once formed, can help your residents and faculty in overcoming the most common challenges and barriers to being successful at scholarship during their time in training. So we all know about the Acgme Common Program Requirements. If you're in program leadership, you're all too familiar with these. They've got a lot of rules and regulations. When it comes to scholarship, it's pretty straightforward, right? It says residents must participate in scholarship. Well, what does that mean? It means they must participate, but there is sort of the low level of participation, and then there's sort of more involved participation. And although it's listed as a core requirement for the program, there's really not a lot of rules or guidelines on what a resident should be doing. Is a case report good enough? We used to get that question a lot. Well, if I just jump on this case report that X faculty is almost ready to submit, does that count? If I do some sort of administrative project, does that count for my scholarship? And, you know, there's no clear guidelines. It's really what your program wants to come up with in terms of guidelines for what you feel like meets the scholarly requirements. And so the hard part is that there's really no rules, and a lot of times we're left to make those rules up and try to be consistent and fair and objective with those on our own. So you might be where we were 5 years ago, where you have these residents, very few of them, that are very interested and engaged and want to do scholarship and understand how to do that. You may have a lot of residents who don't have an interest in that, which is where we were 5 years ago. And quite frankly, we had some faculty who were doing scholarly work, but it was more of a hassle to try to teach a new resident who had never did it before how to do the work and how to partner with them. And so a lot of times faculty were sort of running on their own and not including a resident on the project. And then we would typically get to April and May of a third year, and after 2 years of telling them they need to be doing a project, you should have had a mentor by now, they would start scrambling, thinking like, oh gosh, I'm not going to graduate, they're going to hold me back if I don't have this project done. And it didn't turn out, even when someone did jump on a project or get something done that was sort of a retrospective study based off of a cruddy database in the last few months of their residency, it was certainly not achieving our goal as resident program leaders, which was to teach them sort of the steps from the beginning to end of appraising the literature and doing their own project. So while April showers sometimes bring May flowers, we were experiencing more of a storm season in terms of scholarship.
So we're in year 8 or 9, I think we said the other day, of doing this job together. And, I think like a lot of program leaders, when a problem pops up, you start sort of brainstorming, how are we going to get around this? So I'm married to a neonatologist. And the idea is a little bit stolen from the pediatric subspecialty. So in a pediatric subspecialty training program, every fellow is required to meet with a scholarship oversight committee relatively regularly. And so we kind of started thinking, like, could we do this for us? Sort of the first steps for us were, we were very intentional about however we structured it or however we created it, it had to be a really safe environment. So there wasn't like a predetermined agenda for, hey, we're going to use this committee as sort of a way to deliver lectures or deliver deliverables on sort of to teach people the different parts of resident scholarship. We were really going to be a committee that met the resident where they were in a safe environment and sort of help them to engage with every part of the process. So for an intern, all of our SOC meetings, we'll talk a little bit about structure on the next slide, last 30 minutes in duration. We meet with every resident, and we sort of block out 3 Tuesdays in a row every 6 months. And those meetings at the beginning can be as simple as, like, what do you like? Like, what would get you excited? Because we all know if there's a project that you think is cool or you think is fun, you're much more likely to engage with it. Or what faculty member do you really think is cool and you like to work with? And we also now have a good assessment from this process of who's a good mentor and who's not a good mentor. And so we can kind of guide people away from, that person never really finishes their projects versus that person always takes things through to completion. And so we really take them through every part of the process from, all right, this is what you need to do to get through the IRB. This is what your project will need from the IRB. How can we help you? What questions do you have? What barriers are you having with data analysis? Because we really are trying to meet them every 6 months with where they're at. And do it in an environment where they don't feel judged, they don't feel criticized, and this is not just another meeting that they have to go to or another assessment that they're going to. It's actually relatively low stakes for them because this is a time where they're going to get some help with their project and their project's going to move forward. The poster child for how this has worked is really one of our residents was from rural Wyoming, and she was a great clinical resident. She ended up being our chief resident, and she was destined to go back to community practice in rural Wyoming, and I think pretty openly told us up front, like, I have no interest in ever doing research. I want to just check the box on the project. But that first meeting, the question of, like, well, what do you like? Well, she liked hunting. She grew up hunting elk in Wyoming. And she had always thought it was kind of a bad idea that people wandered out in the woods with minimal first aid training with guns shooting at things. True. And so her thought process was she wanted to find a way to partner with the Division of Natural Resources, because West Virginia is also a big hunting state, to offer Stop the Bleed training. And so the SOC helped her kind of develop a discrete research question about that. Then actually, when we had to reach out to the DNR, because there are now people working on this project together, they found grant funding opportunities. And so she actually got to write a grant, was successfully funded, and drove her project through to completion, which she would have been the poster child probably for, hey, it's April, can I look at a database somewhere and do a quick project to just get out of here? But she left residency knowing how to do a grant, or at least having experience how to do a grant, and had been successfully funded. And so that has been sort of, that was like the most fun, like, celebrating thing for us, was seeing that person succeed. From a composition standpoint, when we started out 5 years ago, we just partnered simply the Division of Education with our Division of Research and Scholarship. So we took our vice chair for research and scholarship, the program director, the associate program director, our couple non-physician research faculty that we had, the assistant program director, the clerkship director, and kind of just put everybody together in the same space and had these regular meetings. The residency leadership kind of has the idea of, like, hey, when this person's on ICU, they really can't do it. They really can't engage with research. They're post-night shift, they've got a family issue. And then the research folks really were the people that had the expertise. We were novice researchers then, and I would argue we're still novice researchers at this point. But they were really able to help people drill down to, hey, that question is way too broad, or that's been done 1,000,000 times, or your IRB is totally going to fail. But hey, if we change this and we'll show up together and put the IRB in together, it was really helpful. This has been a committee now that we have people jumping and volunteering to join. So as it's gone forward over the 5-year period, and manuscript numbers have gone up, poster numbers have gone up, faculty have scholarly requirements too. So we've had our ultrasound division send people voluntarily, our clinical informaticists join voluntarily, our operations division people join voluntarily. And so now we have about 10 faculty that are regular members of this committee. And so what happens in a meeting is someone's like, hey, the EPIC report I ran to get my data on this project isn't working right. And the informaticist is really like, hey, he's calling over to IT right now. We're going to fix that. And usually by the end of their actual SOC session, the 30 minutes, they're like, hey, this person's working on that, and we're going to make this better. And so that has been really, really helpful for even working on the fly. From a schedule frequency standpoint, we thought about doing it quarterly, but to think about 30-minute meetings with 30 residents every quarter, that's a lot. We didn't want people feeling like, oh, this is a really big burden. So we ultimately landed on every 6 months, and they get built into our academic calendar at the beginning of the year. They're in October and April, so they're a little bit away from interview season on both sides so that the program leadership can participate. We decided the 6 months, and it does kind of work well. It gives you enough if you're like in the first 6 months, you're like, hey, here's your research question, here's your idea. It's October. In April, we want you to have a finished IRB. We want you to have a lit review done, and we're going to check back in with you then. It actually gives people enough time to do the work, even around a busy clinical schedule. And it's not so far apart that you lose that accountability that hey, no one's ever going to check on whether I did this or not. So we found that the 6-month interval does work pretty well.
We came up with an internal research milestone that sort of mirrors the EM milestones that we're all familiar with to sort of evaluate every resident every time they met with us at the SOC meeting. So we would conclude the SOC meeting and sort of say, okay, they're a 1 on the scale, they're a 1.5 on the scale, they were 1.5 last time and now they're 2.5 this time. So we'll look at that in detail in a second, but we came up with sort of our own internal milestone for accountability and assessment. And then, as any new process goes, you have to announce this to your residents, you have to announce it to the faculty, you have to frame it in a light that's positive and supportive and doesn't come off as punitive or negative or automatically inducing skepticism with your group. And so we'll give you a few points on how we did that as well. So here's the research milestone that we sort of came up with internally. It looks very much in format and sort of sub-levels comparable to the EM milestones. So we start out on the left side of the milestone, which describes very basic things that we want them to be able to do to achieve a level 1, which is most interns when they come into the program, at least 6 months in. They can usually sort of describe what critically appraising the literature looks like. They've come up with a project idea or a question, and they've done a lit search on that so that they can at least see what gaps are in the medical literature and where they might be able to get something most successfully published. We do toss in the completion of city training. I'm not sure if you all have city training at your institution, but it's sort of a very monotonous, you have to sit down and go through this process and cross off these boxes and get your certificate, or else in our system, which is the KC system, you can't really be included on an IRB. So we walk our residents through that process and get them acquainted with how to do that and the purpose of doing that and get that checked off for level 1. For level 2, we ask them to complete an IRB, and as Chris alluded to earlier, this can be really overwhelming if you've never done it before. The system is not user-friendly at our institution, and so if we would just tell a resident to sit down on their own and do this, that's going to be very overwhelming for most of them. So we would actually generally schedule a small group meeting with our vice chair of research, the faculty mentor, and the resident on the project, and they would sit down in the research director's office. Sometimes they would have lunch and do it then, and she would sort of walk them through from beginning to end what the purpose of the IRB was, what needs to be included, what additional forms you have to have attached, et cetera, and make sure that they understood and at least went through that process one time. And then if they've started their data acquisition for their project, that also was included in level 2. Moving on to level 3 was ensuring that they were continuing to collect their data and they were sort of on a reasonable timeline or trajectory to have the data analysis completed towards the end of second year, early third year, and then we would have them start drafting out their manuscript. And I think our residents, when we first started this, had this idea of, well, I'm just going to write the abstract from start to finish, and then I'll go back later and start writing the manuscript. And really what we try to teach them is that you can storyboard and outline your manuscript from the beginning of your project, even when you don't have your results, and that sort of makes it much, much easier to go back then once your manuscript is done and write your abstract. So basic things like that I think we sort of take for granted after we've done this for years, residents don't always know. So we would sort of talk about the outline of the manuscript, and once they had that done, that would be part of contributing to a level 3 milestone assessment. And then level 4 was sort of the ultimate expectation for residents graduating from the program, was that they would have a manuscript of publishable quality. It did not have to be accepted or published in a journal at the time of graduation, but we wanted to set some reasonable expectations. If you've did your project from start to finish, you have a manuscript that we can submit, then we're okay with that, right? It's way better than what we were looking at, before the development of the SOC and before the focus on increased scholarly productivity, and so we were happy with the manuscript of publishable quality. And then if a resident sort of went above and beyond, as the resident that Chris talked about earlier, she obtained a grant for her project during her research or during her residency. She might have published more than one manuscript. We have people that publish a manuscript and a case report, or a couple of case reports and a manuscript, and so that sort of let them reach level 5. So again, we would assess every resident at the end of the SOC meeting, sort of keep track amongst the committee where they were previously, are they progressing, how they're progressing, if they're not progressing, how we can get them to the next level. And then once a resident achieves a level 4, which some of our residents do halfway through their second year, if they've already published something, then we would drop them off of the SOC meeting schedule, and unless they wanted to do an additional project or continue to meet and work on a different one, we wouldn't necessarily require that they continue to have those ongoing meetings. So that does take the work of the faculty down a little bit. When you have typically 30 residents who are having a meeting, maybe 10 of them have met the requirement halfway through residency, and you can drop those people off of your meeting list. So that's sort of how we structured that internal milestone. And as I referred to before, I think change is hard for all of us. Change is hard to accept ourselves. Change is hard when our residents are hearing there's this, additional stipulation and another committee I have to go before. And when we first developed these meetings and started scheduling them, you could definitely tell that people were sort of scared and skeptical and pessimistic and felt like they were going to come before the firing squad as they came to these SOC meetings. And quite honestly, we were figuring it out ourselves. We didn't know exactly how we wanted to structure it or how conversations were going to go. But honestly, after the first couple of residents met with us, word travels fast. They go back to their colleagues and they were like, hey, nobody got fired, nobody got put on probation, it was all fine. So now our residents just expect it. It's part of our culture. We schedule SOC meetings well in advance through multiple weeks in October, multiple weeks in April, and they just understand that they're going to have a meeting, and it holds them accountable. Now the resident might not do anything until a month or a week before their SOC meeting, between meetings, but they do catch up with their faculty mentor. It sort of forces them to say, where are we at with this project? What do we need to tell the committee? What do we need help with from the committee? And it does help hold them accountable for their actions, for sure. And in recent years, over the past couple of years, we've actually been really successful at getting the resident and the faculty together at the SOC meeting, because it's not really super helpful if you have the resident who's like, well, I haven't talked to the faculty in a while, and I don't know when I'm going to be able to see them, and they have a really busy schedule. So it's really helpful if you can get them all, and we do these meetings on Zoom now, so if you can get them all sort of zoomed in at the same time, it's a much more productive meeting and moves your project forward compared to just meeting with the resident. So we certainly try to get a combined resident faculty mentor meeting going. So does this make our publications and our scholarly efforts perfect? No, it does not make them perfect, but it is way better for our program at least than what it was before we started the SOC in 2018. So a few sort of rough statistics up here. So you can see our classes of 15, 16, 17, and 18. We graduated a total of 37 people over those 4 years, and 4 of them had a project that we would have considered of publishable quality by the time they got out of residency. And since then, in 19, 20, and 21, we have had a total of 19 publications out of the 30 residents that have graduated from the program. The other ones have done things. You might look at that and say, well, I thought you required them to do something. They've all done things, but we've had 19 of those successfully published by the time of graduation. A few got published after graduation, and some were projects that had a lot of time and effort put into them, but ultimately just didn't get published. But nonetheless, the residents went through the process. They understand how to develop a research question and work through it, and that was sort of our goal as program leaders, was to make sure they knew that by the time they graduated. Here's a couple of our residents presenting. And they've did all kinds of different work. So they've did case reports for the Journal of Emergency Medicine. We have a big ultrasound division, so a lot of them do ultrasound case reports, orbital cellulitis, dyspnea, atrial flutter induced by stimulants. Chris and I do a lot of med ed research, so we've studied the MSPE some, we've studied the slow some, so we always include residents on those sorts of projects. We have an EMS division in our institution as well, and so they go out and have fun at sort of mass gathering type events and conduct research based on that, mentored by their research faculty. So we've had lots of different types of projects that have been very successful over the years, and it's nice to see these things in publication and feel like you've been able to make a positive impact on residents actually understanding the process and being able to participate in it, more than just sort of checking the box in a hurried fashion, which is what we sort of used to do. So that's an overview of our SOC committee and how we developed it and some of the successes we've had from it. And certainly, again, we thank you all for coming on the last day of conference. And if you have any questions about our process or something that we didn't cover, we'd be happy to answer those.
Sure.
Yeah, so just kind of like, just sort of trying to figure out the capacity or volume of time you commit to that, which seems crazy.
It's not small, yeah.
Because I'm thinking 30 plus 20 times 30 times 2.
So it ends,
Maybe it's a year.
yeah, so it ends up being about 24 hours every 6 months. So, because some people have essentially tested out because they've hit the level 4. So there's always some people that have rotated off, and so we block basically a whole Tuesday for 3 weeks in April and in October. So 24 hours in October and 24 hours in April. We start our interns in April.
Yeah. We have like an intro, so the interns have like an intro lunch with our research division where they sort of explain to them what the SOC is and start thinking in your first few months if you have a particular area of interest, because you can't bring the intern in July and say, okay, you're going to have a first meeting in October and have these expectations. So it's super low key with them. We meet with them officially in April and sort of start brainstorming project ideas. And we schedule 3 8-hour days, but often, one thing the pandemic has taught us is that Zoom is an effective format for a lot of our ongoing meetings, especially when you get a large committee. So we have about 10 members on our committee now. And sometimes our schedule based on resident and faculty schedules might have, an 8 to 8:30 meeting and 8:30 to 9. Then we have a break from 10 to 10:30 and then we hop back on. So the Zoom format's super helpful in that you can sort of be in your home or be in your office and have your resident hop on and hop off, and you can do things, in between. So we do schedule them sort of 8 hours a day, but a lot of the days, especially once we get some third years that have already met the requirements, the first year the interns don't meet with us during the first month. So, you're probably roughly meeting with 15 to 20 of your residents each 6 months once everything is kind of said and done. So they are definitely long days, but we just schedule those days in advance. And not all of the members can be there every single, committee meeting that you have with a resident, but most of them are very attentive and outside of other work meetings and stuff, usually block that day or those several days that we have planned in October and April to chime in and join the SOC meeting. So it's definitely a commitment that you have to get some buy-in from your faculty. And like we said, our group started out real small. It was basically Chris and I, our research director, a couple other people that were sort of productive in research, and that was about it. But we've actually not forced anyone to come to this committee, and I think people have learned, especially as junior faculty, that showing up and participating in the discussion and the brainstorming often gives them ideas for projects they want to carry out, and you have a resident sitting right there who has a similar interest. So it's nice for pairing people up as well.
Yes, sir.
Who's actually at the individual meetings with executor, obviously the president, and then probably the primary mentor.
Uh-huh.
With you, is that the full meeting?
And then we have all this. Typically, the entire committee comes to most of the meetings. They all block it off, and so we send it out with our annual lecture schedule of we have another tab on it that's hey, here's our CCC, our PEC meetings, and our SOC meetings, and the members of those committees hey, just remember to block your calendar for that. And people are really, I think because of what Erica said, that hey, I know if I show up, I'm going to get a project. I'm probably, there's a good chance it's going to be at least a poster, and it's going to probably be a manuscript because the resident's going to have accountability. There's going to be people driving this. We do not have a problem getting quorum at this point. In the early days, it literally was just us and our research team with some and bribing them even with pizza. Hey, we'll buy pizza, come. But now it's really morphed into people are hey, SOC's next week. I'll see you next week. They get excited about it.
And they're fun. They're very laid back. They're not intimidating, scary meetings. We do hold people accountable. We set timelines during the meeting. Okay, you told us you need to do this. We're going to follow up with you in a couple of weeks. So we don't completely wait 6 months before we touch base with them again. There are definitely multiple timelines throughout those 6 months of expectations and accountability. But people, I think, seem to enjoy them now.
So just kind of that format of the meeting, it sounds like as you go through the milestones, you might be displaying it and saying we collectively.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
we all agree or right about here.
Yep.
That's exactly what we do.
That's exactly what we do.
Is there any objection to that? So it's not like you're whisking them away and saying,
No, yeah, we do
No.
exactly that. And then we say, hey, last time you were a 1.5, and thanks for going off and doing some data collection and storyboarding your manuscript. We really think you're a 2 or 2.5 now. You cool with that?
and then you're kind of identifying barriers.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And
Yeah, and
sometimes
some people are super motivated to keep pushing forward, and they go from a 1.5 to a 3.5 between their 6-month SOC meetings. And then some people were well, they haven't really did too much differently between last meeting and this meeting. So what's our next steps to push them past that? So just like any other milestone we use, really, it's who's sort of falling behind the level expected for that PGY level, and then we address people who are falling behind and support them and help them.
we're happy to chat more in the back, too. I think there's someone else coming in to speak, but we're happy to chat in the back. And thank you all for coming and the
Thank you all
excellent
for
questions.
coming. We appreciate your time.